Hello to our viewers in Europe and in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's discussion. This is the fifth and final virtual event in a three-day symposium hosted by the American Council on Germany and the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, USA, titled 6 Months into the Biden Presidency, Transatlantic Trends and Aspirations. In this session, we'll focus on global trade and investment. And for this panel, we're joined by three experts. Dr. Laura von Daniels is the deputy head of the research division, the Americas, at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, or Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. She's actually joining us from Italy, and Laura, a huge thanks to you for interrupting your vacation to join us today. Herzlichen Dank.
My pleasure.
Also joining us from Minnesota is Dr. Daniel Hamilton. He's the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation Distinguished Fellow and Director of the Global Europe Program at the Wilson Center. He's one of the country's foremost experts on modern Europe and on the transatlantic relationship. He's also a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at the Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. Dan, a huge thanks to you too for joining us today.
Thank you.
And last but not least, to lead us through today's conversation is Julia Friedlander. She is the C. Boyden Gray Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the GeoEconomics Center at the Atlantic Council. Previously, she served as a Senior Policy Advisor for Europe in the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence at the U.S. Department of the Treasury from 2015 to 2017, and then from 2019 to 2020. Julia, thanks so much for being with us as well.
Absolutely.
So before I hand the floor over to Julia, let me just remind our viewers that if you have a question today, you can submit it using the Q&A function in Zoom, and we will do our best to fold your questions into the conversation. And with that, Julia, it's over to you.
Thanks so much, Steve, and thanks so much to the American Council in Germany and the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung for having us here today. I'm really happy to be having this conversation with both Laura and Dan. I was hoping to have sort of, again, I think, as we said, a free-flowing conversation. So please put your questions in the chat function and we'll bring you in as the conversation goes along. Maybe just to start us out, I think that maybe many on this call might have seen the, maybe we could call it controversial at this point, a graphic that the Economist published in to accompany an article on Biden's approach to China competition. And this showed a very stark difference in trading relationships between the United States and China over the course of 20 years, making a point that the U.S. trading relationship globally has precipitously declined. A couple of others have jumped in to say, but wait a second, this graphic does not include services trade and it does not include the European Union. And to me, those were two critical failings. Of course, I think it was a graphic that was too controversial and too juicy not to show. And I think it made an interesting point, but it wasn't complete. So I'd like to turn to both of you to sort of maybe start us off and share your impressions of what something like that represents. For the US-EU trading relationship. Maybe starting with Dan.
Okay, thank you, Julia. Yes, my colleague Joe Quinlan and I do an annual survey in the transatlantic economy precisely because of these kinds of issues. It just seems for 20 years now, the media, and if I may say many political leaders, even government agencies, they tend to reduce commercial activity to trade. And yet we know commercial activity is much more than that. They also tend to even skew it further by only talking about trade in goods, usually. That's not just a failure of The Economist. German statistical agencies, the German government tends to make the same skewed picture. There was a whole discussion in European media a few months ago when Eurostat, the European statistical agency, came out with basically the same thing about China being the EU's biggest trading partner, but they only talking about trade in goods, and that was only for the COVID year, which is a off year. didn't mention trade and services. Trade and services is where most jobs are in the United States and Europe. And that's where the US and Europe are, of course, very, very intertwined. There's not much, in fact, there aren't many other services economies even in the world. So if you ignore that, you've already got a skewed picture. But at least for the US, and that's important to the Economist article, most American companies would rather go across the ocean and be where their customer is rather than send stuff across the ocean. So even though the US is such a big economy, trade volumes are high, we're not tend to be a trading country in the same way as Germany is. We tend to go and invest around the world. So American companies are everywhere. And one can't ignore the investment flows that really produce goods and services all around the world. If you add all of that together, you recenter your understanding of who's your major commercial partner. For the United States, that's still actually Europe, not China. And for Europe, it's the same. The United States is by far Europe's most important commercial partner, bar none. It also doesn't include jobs, where the jobs are, research and development, innovation flows. All of those things are heavily skewed to the transatlantic economy.
Thank you. And Laura, what's your impression of this? I mean, why would this be so popular to repeat if it were inaccurate? Why doesn't seem to be in anyone's particular interest to perpetuate a narrative like this?
Maybe first of all, I would completely agree with what Dan said about the ties between the EU and the US being much thicker than just the trade relationship, and deeper as well. I mean, Dan already talked about the relevance of services, but also investment streams, jobs, research and development, and innovation. And I think this is all pretty obvious that these ties are also much more meaningful than each of our economies' ties with China, which is also an important point, I think, which is you can see that in one graph on trade data. But I think, at least if I speak for my own home country, Germany, I would say that in the public debate, you can see that even in the run-up to the elections in the fall, politicians are struggling with finding a balance between preserving our economic interest in relations with China and then also cooperating with the US on China policy. And since Dan already mentioned it, trade is still quite important, perhaps even more important symbolically than in the numbers. But every German of knowledge knows that every fourth job in Germany is related to trade policy or to trade relations. So people care very much about also the numbers. Each year we are presented with the numbers for Germany being exporting world champion or second in the race or something. Apparently the symbolic value of this is really important. So maybe there is some reason why people would share that. I think it's different for other economies in Europe. If you even look at the EU 27 countries, not even including the UK, you see a huge divergence in interests. I'm in Italy right now. I think our interests are quite similar. Italy is also a trading economy, a trading goods economy. But then there are other countries who would definitely take different trade policy decisions, different from Germany's policy. So I don't know for what reason, what drove the Economist to publish that graph, but at least you could say you definitely draw attention doing it. Maybe it helps you to sell your paper a bit more.
Of course, undoubtedly. And I agree with how both of you have portrayed it. I think it's also, having worked with this stuff myself, always very hard to quantify. And if you have to show simple visual representation, services trade is never easy. But maybe we could go there a little bit just directly into the China stuff. I mean, I think the open question right now, I think, is how we're going to formulate a transatlantic China policy that allows countries to maintain their and acknowledge their dependencies, right? And I think that there's a lot, Laura, as you mentioned, from the German perspective, there's a lot of narrative about how Germany is dependent, but much less of a narrative about how the U.S. is, right? Maybe in certain strategic supply chain issues, as we've heard a lot about over the past months, but a lot of this also lies in the financial sector, and a lot of what we're seeing now about market delistings and the behavior of U.S. banks in China. So, just start us, off, Dan. And what are your impressions of how this sort of walk and chew gum debate has developed since Biden has taken office, and what the perspectives are going forward?
Yeah, well, I think we all are kind of taking a step back from, say, the 25 years after the end of the Cold War, when sort of globalization was sort of the prevailing paradigm, and it seemed you could connect with anybody and everybody profits. There was sort of one world type of mantra. It's underscored by the internet and this idea. And I think what we realize is simply connecting with others doesn't mean everybody wins necessarily the same way. There are winners and losers, both within countries, but also it creates certain kinds of dependencies between countries. And we're seeing some of that now, that there's asymmetric dependence. And now we're in a more competitive world in which we are dealing with other rising powers. And we have to understand how that interdependence, that mutual or asymmetric dependence, is influencing our economic relations, or how economic relations could be weaponized or instrumentalized to pursue sort of national advantage. I think that's the frame we're changing into, and each country is having its debate sort of at a different, cycle and pace. But I think if you look at what the Biden administration has done, while there is a very clear bipartisan consensus about China, I think, in the United States, the administration has gone quite far toward sort of the European formulation to try to talk about China. That is, we use somewhat different words, or the administration used somewhat, but basically it's going the same direction. There are areas where we need to work and want to work with China, and it's because of our own interests. Climate change, for instance, the Iran deal, non-proliferation, North Korea, a number of areas where, it's not a favor to China. We're all in this together. There are other areas where the EU and the United States, Germany and the United States, agree that China is a real competitor in some ways that are not compatible with its obligations under the World Trade Organization. We agree on most of those issues. And then third, Tony Blinken says adversary. The EU's word is systemic rival. Whatever you want to choose. We agree that there is something bigger going on, that China is sort of creating a real challenge to the existing, some Europeans would say rules-based order, and how we deal with that. I think that's where the U.S. debate has been quite intense over the last number of years, and where the European debate really hasn't been. But now we're kind of on that frame, these three ways of thinking about China. Now we have to fill it out. There are clear differences in nuances, as Laura said, in country perspectives. But I think that idea, despite those differences, we're kind of on some new path of some type of strategic alignment about how we should engage with China. We just have to work out now details, because it's still early days for the Biden administration.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that I agree with you, Dan, that the rhetoric actually for all that we've seen in bipartisan pressure and bipartisan consensus, the rhetoric actually in Washington is becoming a little bit more temperate and landing. And I would argue that we needed to, not only because the Trump administration was in power, but that China policy in Washington across all party spectrums and all fields had to sort of land in a constructive place. What does that constructive place look like to you, Laura? I mean, what do you think? I mean, where you're in Italy right now? Maybe if you want to speak to how the Italians see it too, I would love to hear it. It's a little more similar to Germany than one might expect, perhaps. But But how do you see this in Berlin right now, especially as we go into electoral season?
If I think about party programs, platforms, if you try to analyze those of the German parties, I think they all commonly acknowledge that China has turned into something different and is more, in many respects, not just a competitor. On the other hand, I think from a European perspective, we're not connected via the Pacific, right? So the threat, the rivalry that exists from a US standpoint is not the same for Europeans, not for Germans. And you might say that's naive and we should pretty much change our analysis there. And I think Europeans are increasingly doing that. I think the French were much quicker in realizing what dangers are growing out of an interdependency that can be weaponized. I think it took us in Germany much longer to realize those difficulties in the interdependent relationship with China. But still, I mean, my expectation as a German, and I think that counts for most of our political parties as well, is we will have a passive role in this realignment between US and European positions on China. I hope that we have some similar perceptions on that. Also, if you look at the outcome of what has been discussed at the NATO meeting last month and the EU-US meetings, expectations are, as far as I see it, that we improve our analysis, that we agree to the threat perception, that we engage in a cooperative policy, and then we can sort of derive from that policy in the area of digitalization, technology, and so on. You will get to precise policies, right? And I think we're all for it, and probably all of our political parties in Germany are all for this kind of cooperation with the US. But when it gets to taking on more responsibility in terms of, if you look beyond economic cooperation, if you move towards security cooperation and so on, I'm less convinced or have a weaker feeling, let's say, that we're on the same page. I think Germans are not expecting that we're expected to be engaged in the Pacific or to be engaged in the South China Sea or get involved more than at this point, I think. And I think that's what you see in all of those political programs. So no matter who's going to enter into office, you will have some aberration of what I just said.
Mm-hmm. I mean, but the EU is not they're not, it's not a bystander at all, really, in technical and regulatory areas. And Germany is, in many ways, the linchpin of this, right? As the economic heavyweight. And so, what I would like to see is an acknowledgement of agency. Right. And I think, as Dan says, it doesn't have to look exactly the same. And the sort of imprimatur of a transatlantic policy doesn't have to, the success thereof does not rely on everybody using the same words at the same times and the same tools. But I think, coming into maybe Dan, I'll turn back to you here, bringing in a viewer. One of our participants is asking, what are some of the specifics of this, right? So what are certain areas of alignment that you see where, again, maybe not using the same rhetoric, maybe not using exactly the same timeline that we can expect something concrete?
Well, I think there are areas where we have said that we want to work with China, we need to. And I think that I mentioned which areas as examples. On the competitor, the EU, Japan, the United States have been carrying out a dialogue about how to address China's failings in the WTO. It seems to me that we should lift that now and take it forward now more than before, because the United States under the Biden administration has said, it's not trying to blow up the WTO, it's trying to reform it. but it needs some reform. And a big challenge to the WTO is China and its obligations. I think we have a lot of agreement there. So the question is, can we move this forward? There are some challenges in the WTO process right now. And as I said, the Biden administration just isn't fully there yet. So you have to give it a little time. But I think there will be more alignment on that than maybe one would see right now. On the systemic rivalry issue, I think that's where more transatlantic discussion has to happen because that's the issue. So, and Laura, sort of gave an indicative example. I think for many Americans focusing on Europe and thinking about China, it's not about sending Europe or NATO or something to Asia. It's that China's coming to Europe. It's not about a pivot to Asia. It's Asia's pivot to Europe that one needs to think about. So the China's challenge is not far away. It's right at home. Investment in defense-related supply chain issues that affect European German companies. Investment in ports, strategic ports, all along Europe's periphery that could be quite important going forward. China's engagement through the Belt and Road, including a number of European countries, the 16+1, it was 17+1, it's back to 16+1, China and East Europe, Central East European countries, but seems to be falling apart. So maybe that's an interesting development. But a whole area, not just in terms of China in Europe, but China and its challenge to the global commons. Europe is so dependent on trade, as Laura said, it is dependent on open navigation, freedom of information, space, all of that. And there are challenges that are being posed by China in those spaces of the global commons. So it's not that Europe is a bystander here. It can't afford to be. It literally cannot afford to be a bystander. And Germany in particular, as you said, is sort of the swing state. I just think the German debate is lagging in terms of the full appreciation of what this China challenge means. It's seen as something far away in Asia somewhere that the Americans have to figure out. And it's not. It's in Europe right now, and we have to think about it. The last piece on the security side, I realize we're not supposed to talk about that, is the entente between Russia and China. It's not that they're having an alliance really, but if you think about how they might work together in a crisis situation, Russia's risk calculus could be changed by the nature of how it works with China. And so the China challenge is not only about China, it's also about Russia. And some East European countries, some EU member states are really worried about that piece, maybe more than some others. And the United States through NATO and Germany, have some obligations there. I think we have to frame the China challenge in this way, not just about something very far away in another hemisphere.
Yeah, no, I think so too. I don't know if whether I might pick a little bit whether the German debate still sees it as that far away, but Laura, for you though, how does this reflect on concepts of European strategic autonomy? Obviously, when Brussels crafts strategies as such, right, whether it's competition or whatnot, we could go down the list of paper that the Commission produces that are related to this debate, right? What is to you the strategic autonomy thing actually potentially look like, right? Does it require some maneuvering both from China and from the United States in order to defend interests?
Well, I'm just observing that we're decreasingly using the term strategic autonomy in Germany. Sovereignty, yes. We're still struggling to understand what the French or what Macron precisely means with European sovereignty. And then I think you can say the political class in Germany is probably split. I'm not sure if in half or if it's 1/3 to 2/3, people agreeing that we should be more sovereign, others saying that it's actually bad policy because it's challenging, or it's just hurting our relationship with the US. So I think for every senior German politician now who still speaks about strategic autonomy or European sovereignty, what they have in mind is something that is in line with US-EU interests. It is something that increases our own capacities to take care of our own regional conflicts and difficulties we have in Europe and in the surroundings of Europe. I think that that's fair to say that this is the common denominator by now. It's not a concept that is used to split the EU from the US or to develop into a third power that is in competition with the US or anything of that sort. I hope this at least partly answers your question.
No. I think it was just also responding to something that came in. I mean, I agree with you. I also think that I never really saw it as a threat to U.S. interests the way some other people did, or some other people worried it might become, but more as a PR capability for European governments to communicate urgency, immediacy of issues, right? Which is something that I think that's one thing where I do feel that the German government has not followed through in saying, we need to do this because everyone, we don't live in an island of safety. But I think so. Just, I mean, to shift this a little bit more to back to economics, which is what we're supposed to be talking about. When we look at Biden strategies on China and how we're able to get bipartisan consensus on industrial policy and on infrastructure spending, for example, there's an explicit link between domestic economic renewal, right? So, 30 years in systemic economic problems that the United States has ignored, and competition with China, right? And so from Laura, maybe just coming back to you first, like when you see this policy developing on the US side, A, do you think it's just a convenient rhetoric to kill two birds with one stone, and B, or is it something that European governments are sort of going to emulate anyway, even if they don't put the words to it?
I would go even further and say that European policy and US policy in that respect are developing in a very similar direction. And I think when we had the EU-US meeting last month, I think Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission president, pointed out that actually if Biden was able to implement everything that he's planning on doing in terms of economic stimulus and structural programs, you end up with pretty much the same numbers, investments of the same numbers. You also have the similarity that a certain percentage of the money spent is tied to policy goals like greening the economy, making sure that the green transition is financed the right way, investing in research and development, so on. Also investing in structurally hurting regions, whether it's in the US or in Europe. So I think you do see a lot of similarity, and therefore probably also you hear very little complaints about US programs in Europe. Quite the opposite. I think many people here, and there I think I can speak also for Italy and for Germany, many people have the feeling that this, if Biden succeeds with all of those programs, it's really the last chance to help this country, to help people that have been hurting for a long period in the US. And we were watching it. I mean, US citizens were watching it. The whole world was watching how there are groups within the American society that are not taken care of. And there are problems like the health system or the educational system that need investment and they need money spent. And I mean, the same goes for Germany. But sort of having a structural reform of those policy areas would be crucial, given that the US is the most important economy in the world. You know, it was sort of difficult, odd to see how this money is not being spent on the population at home, or those parts of the population that are so disadvantaged and that suffered from globalization and opening of the economy and so on. Restructuring of the US economy, automation. And so there are many reasons. It wasn't just trade. It was not just China entering the WTO. But, you know, you could see all of those factors and then you were wondering, why are they not doing something to help people that are being hurt by those policies? And so it's we couldn't agree more that this needs to be done. I think that's pretty much common sense. And across the political spectrum, again, in Germany, it's the same perception that these programs are necessary.
And in a way, perhaps strengthening a domestic market, right? That in the future will be, you know, profitable and beneficial to trade interests as well, right? So.
Right. Someone needs to buy those German and Italian cars. Right. That's true.
It's true. Even though they're pretty much American cars built in America for Americans. But Dan, I mean, do you agree with Laura that there's no trepidation on European side about the trajectory of domestic economic policy? I mean, the Atlantic Council hosted Brian Deese a couple of weeks ago. He talked about, you know, a renewal of U.S. industrial policy, right, and hammered home, you know, of course, saying, you know, defending, you know, U.S. free market practices. Of course, this was not. This is by no means an extremist position, but you know, he did hammer home on Buy America and Defense Production Act and all those sort of like, you know, buzzwords that, you know, the second someone says it in Washington, there are phone calls from Europe saying, we don't like this so much.
Yeah, no, I think there are quite a few issues, in fact. But I think the main point of the first 6 months, if you will, of the Biden administration has been to set a new tone and to say we are on many issues really quite aligned, also in our ambitions going forward. And that let's take some first actions that will sort of get us back on some sort of track, realizing our number one challenge across the Atlantic is moving both our societies and our economies from sickness to health. That's the overarching priority right now. Everything else, frankly, is secondary. And so that, I think, you know, great progress has been made, even though we're fighting now another, you know, kind of issue on the health side. But through the different summits in June, there was a lot of commitments made. There has to be some follow through. But that's the overarching, where we are quite aligned, I think. And frankly, you see the economy on both sides of the Atlantic really coming back. So we'll be in a different position in terms of dealing with some of these issues. But we shouldn't ignore that we have those issues. You mentioned, you know, concern on the European side about the United States. So let me just put in one word back on strategic autonomy. I think it's a phrase that was used by Europeans to somehow cope with Donald Trump. It's a term that's, you know, beyond its sell date. Because it was a response. It never really had a European consensus. I have many European colleagues from governments call me and say, you know, what do you think this means? We don't know ourselves, but we're afraid to say it in open EU councils. And it did try to be sort of play both sides, if you will. It was a hedging effort. But I don't think it has much meaning in the way that is useful to us. I think where we agree, to get beyond the jargon, is on both sides of the Atlantic, we want a more capable Europe. That's what we want. Laura mentioned it. She said the debate's turning toward the capabilities that Europe could have. Americans would welcome that. If Europe could be, and I've tried to define it in my world in terms of operational, you know, consequence. If Europe could be, for instance, the first responder to crises all along its neighborhood and its periphery, and have the capabilities that will allow it to do that, play that role, that doesn't contradict NATO, but it puts Europe in the position of responding first, which would allow the United States to deal with the lots of other issues also in the Asia-Pacific region. But Europe isn't the first responder. It can't actually do that stuff because it doesn't have those capabilities. So let's get that list together and let's focus on that. I think that would be a way to talk about strategic autonomy, if that's what you're talking about, that's way that we could get behind. But it's about a more capable Europe. And so the economic side of that, I think there have been politicians in Europe that use that term to talk about a more protectionist Europe. It's about industrial policy. It's about building up certain kinds of industrial alliances that don't have third-party participation. On the European Defense Fund, in those areas where it's really about jobs, they have opened up now to the United States, to U.S. and third-party companies. So that that I think is taking care of some U.S. concerns. But the Europeans have concerns in the United States too. We suspended our tariff wars, over Airbus, Boeing, and over Section 232, but they're not resolved. We have said by the end of the year, but we'll see. It was a good faith effort, but it doesn't mean it's finished. The whole privacy shield and the personal data flows issue that were frozen by the European Court last summer are not resolved. Those are deeply rooted really in different legal regimes. I don't think negotiators are going to get it fixed. So they're trying to fix it with a new regime, but frankly, it'll go back to court again. I just hosted Max Schrems a couple of weeks ago, and I can tell you, this is a seriously deep issue that we have to address. So there are concerns like that. Buy America, you mentioned, there's public procurement issues, the Jones Act, these kinds of things. These are not going anywhere anytime soon. The Biden administration is not stepping back from that. So the challenge we have is how to deal with these sort of lingering irritants that plague our relationship and hold us back, and try to get into a new frame where we have to think of domestic renewal as a common challenge, because that's back to sickness and health. That's our real issue right now. And I think we are aligned economically more than we were in terms of the economic cycle now that we're both growing again and coming out of this. So let's harness that. And to integrate climate and these environmental issues into that sort of what the president would say, build back better approach. Because frankly, at least in the United States, making this only an environmental issue isn't going to win the day. It has to be seen as something that kind of changes our economy, our society for the better. It has to have that message in it. It's a much deeper challenge than the environment. And even if you want to take the environment, even if we did everything both the US and the EU said we're going to do to meet our commitments, we still won't get there. If you look at any experts that say we're not on track yet, we would have to have a reduction in emissions equivalent to the collapse of those emissions during the COVID year, every year now for the next 10 years. Well, that's not going to happen because our economies are coming back. So we have to think much harder about this, and also realize it's not an either or. In our study each year, we look at the transatlantic energy economy. It's very striking in terms of the Green Deal in Europe, the transition, Energiewende. 4 of the top companies with long-term contracts for renewable energy in Europe, 4 of the top 5 in Europe are American companies. It's the American companies that are contracting for the Energiewende. They're the ones that the Energiewende are going to be relying on to make things really change. So it's not that Europe's going to do this in some autonomous way, because we're so deeply intertwined in how our economies work. So, and American companies are the largest provider of jobs in Germany, outside of Germany, more than other EU countries. Some German states invest more in the United States than they do in the rest of the European Union. Bavaria, Rhineland-Pfalz, Baden-Württemberg. So we have to understand this deep interconnection, that we're not going to do this somehow on our own, and that we should just turn to each other and say, now, how can we do this together?
Mm-hmm. But I mean, a lot of these, I think you make a fair point about some of these. I call them almost like old school tools, right? Jones Act, Buy America. These are all for a different industrial age that doesn't exist anymore. And I wonder, and I myself think, well, this has a lot more bark than bite, because when we actually look at what we need to do, the implementation of these tools doesn't really get us anywhere. I mean, so so maybe Laura, looking at sort of the new areas for for investment expansion, right? I mean, maybe you could say something about financial services, about climate finance. I mean, carbon border adjustment tax. So give us a little bit of a feel for what this looks like in implementation.
Sure. I just wanted to add something to what I said before. We generally in Europe have a positive view, I think, of the Biden policies being implemented now. But it's true that there's been a lot of critique because of the use or the frequent use of the idea or the term, the BiAmerican policy. And I think it's really easy, or even the fact that the tariffs haven't been lifted for good yet. I think it's pretty easy to convince Europeans that a good US foreign policy for the middle class is not a threat to us and our interests by doing two things. First is to make sure that trade policy is not used as a solution to domestic structural problems of the US economy, which is sort of related to what you said, Julia, about old school policies. I mean, as soon as we get the feeling that old school policies are still being used, even after Trump, people will react negatively. So the second thing, a huge signal, I think, would be to show that the US is willing to cooperate a bit more on certain WTO problems, foremost the appellate body. I think lifting the blockage in the appellate body would be a huge sign. Any step towards that, I think, would be a huge sign. And that, I think, is enough to convince people that, you have to wait. We have to take care of our own domestic problems first. We also have midterm elections next fall. You Europeans have elections too. You know what that means to achieving certain foreign policy goals and cooperating with other nations on trade policy. So I think we can all agree that it can be difficult during election seasons. But if we get a little more of those signs, I think people are already convinced enough that cooperation is possible. Another area, just to mention one area that you just referred to, Julia, is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. That's tough. The EU is now sort of leading the discussion, or came forward with a very sophisticated approach. And I think it would be tough to ask that we should just stop moving in that direction. But I think we still have this window of opportunity to find a way to do this together and not fall apart over this one policy issue. And the same goes for investment and the EU-China deal just before Christmas last year. I think, the EU is actually having the Commission is going to have a really hard time getting agreement of the European Parliament, given the situation in China, given human rights problems and so on. I think many EU parliamentarians, European parliamentarians, are not convinced at all that our own investment agreement with China should ever be implemented. So I think there's still lots of room for finding common grounds and cooperating and finding ways of having harmonized or very similar policies. It's not too late yet, and I think it's also still very much common sense among us Europeans that we need to be aware of the domestic implementation problems that Biden is facing. I think you can definitely count on that. People are calculating those difficulties into their own equations of what is possible, what options we have in the transatlantic cooperation.
And in that regard, whether one can be successful in selling a foreign policy for the middle class, right? It's almost like a domestic. It's almost domestic policy for the middle class, but it's foreign policy. I mean, again, how do you read that? Maybe just because a viewer did ask to define for us to define after when Dan was talking about domestic economic renewal. So what does it mean to you when is it also just sort of a 1-2 punch to use that phrase?
Are you asking me or Laura?
I was asking Laura first, just because so it's okay.
Sorry. How do you read this? I mean, we're discussing it a lot, the concept, because it's interesting. Also, it's not entirely new, but it's interesting to see how this is, how you have a whole policy approach that integrates domestic and foreign policy. I think we're just worried, or many Europeans, let's say at least among, if you look at the political advisors and so on, I think what they're worried about is that this is not simply being used to improve the situation of the US middle class, but that this means that you're maximizing the interest of the US middle class at the disadvantage of other countries' middle classes. And as I said, I don't think this is necessarily the case. I think there's common ground, and there are lots of opportunities to cooperate on policy and then bring home deliverables, as we all say these days, to the middle classes of all of our countries in Europe and the US. But if you pitch one against the other, obviously that creates sort of negative emotions in Europe, I think.
Sure. No, I completely agree. And I think it's a shift from an offensive policy to a defensive policy, right? And sort of in terms of using, for the way, I perceive of it from the viewpoint of economic statecraft is instead of using punitive tools, you're using encouraging tools of encouragement. And I think that's, they take longer. They're not as, they don't deliver a headline, but are ultimately much more sustainable. Speaking of sustainable policies, Dan, can I ask you about the corporate taxation agreement? I know that this is, from a perspective of a lot of us, that is really the landmark thing that's come out of the past couple of months, and what that means for foreign policy for the middle class, again, because that's another framework that it's being the administration is using, but also for corporate transparency and how that then parlays to the larger digital debate.
Sure, let me let me address that, but let me do it in the context of what you and Laura are just talking about. I think if you look at what has happened in the United States in recent years, the pandemic, recession, the inequalities, the inequities, the systemic racism, all the issues we've been going through, the case for domestic self-renewal in America is just self-evident. We have to do this. I think all of our partners want us to do it too. The United States is not going to help anybody else in the world if it can't help itself. So it's again, a prioritization here. But I think it can be done in a way that is not, as you said, offensive or defensive. I'd say it's more whether it's negative or positive. And what the Biden administration is trying to project, we could debate its success at the moment, but is to not always think about China and international competition as sort of, the Darwinian world where it's only transactional and punitive, but you can set forth a positive agenda that maintains the US as the primary leading power in the world, if you will, with its allies, seeing allies as a reason it has that position, not as a drag and a burden, and then to define that positive agenda together. That was the message, frankly, of at least three summits in June, from the G7 to the US-EU and NATO summits. Also the message, frankly, of our bilateral summits with some allies and, as Tony Blinken would say, adversaries. but that's defining that positive agenda going forward now is, I think, the task, and making sure these irritants, as I say, don't stop it. So on the tax deal, I mean, there are lots of things in the tax deal, but what was interesting to me is that you say the Biden administration basically saying it wants to return to multilateral approaches, and it would be what I would call cascading multilateralism. You get some agreement in the G7 in the core of really important countries. Then you take that agreement to the G20, 80% of world GDP. If you can get agreement in both of those groups, you can take it to the rest of the world and try to get a truly multilateral deal. The tax deal is sort of an example of this, but there are actually other things going on, I think, where the Biden administration is approaching it that way, that building in new kinds of variable geometry of like-minded countries, if you will, that are not just old structures. And that's, I think, a very interesting new departure. So I think we should look at that and how the Europe, Germany fits into that. On the tax deal itself, you know, it's not over till it's over. So I just wrote a piece for the Wilson Center. It's on the Wilson Center website, going through both the opportunities here, but some of the challenges. And this is my point. We, US and Europe, could be, in fact, the ultimate block to the tax deal, even though we got it this far. We have a problem in the United States domestically with our polarized Congress and our country, obviously. So in order to pass part of that tax deal, you have to amend tax treaties. That requires 2/3 of the US Senate to agree. The leading Republican members of the relevant committees, when they saw the tax deal, they said it was crazy. So getting 2/3 of the US Senate to agree to something like this is going to take some work, when right now it's evenly split. That's quite a lift. So we'll have to see how we do domestically on this. Part of the tax deal could be done without that requirement, but not all of it. And I think the deal is contingent. There are two pillars of the deal. We don't have to get into it, but the US prefers one that doesn't need the tax treaty amendments. The rest of the world wants the other part, and that's part of the problem. But Europe is also have a challenge here. The EU could scupper the deal too. You have a number of EU member states who don't agree. They haven't signed up yet. And so the EU doesn't have any agreement on this. And while those are small countries like Estonia or Ireland or Hungary, for those countries, it's quite existential how their economic model works. Tax competence is not an EU competence, but the EU is pushing, the Commission is pushing to this time to make it EU legislation. So that'll delay it also for at least a couple of years, frankly, just because the EU process is so interminable, if I may say. And so this isn't something that's going to happen soon. We should just understand that. If we can get an OECD G20 kind of deal by October in its basic frame, then we move to this implementation phase. But that'll take, I would argue, a number of years. This is not something that's going to happen tomorrow.
Will that be given? I mean, again, if EU processes are interminable, then we can also compare that to interminable processes in our bicameral system. So, but does that fend off autonomous digital services taxes? And no, right?
That's that's part of the problem. That even though the U.S. has said let's move ahead this way, this will take care of that. A number of European countries have said no, we're moving ahead anyway. So USTR has 6 months to kind of figure this out with those countries. Otherwise, it has the authority right now to impose more punitive measures against those countries. Not just the EU, but the UK is included in that. So this is by no means done. There's a lot of, I mean, Washington, frankly, is so irritated by this digital tax idea, despite this global deal, that, that doesn't help the transatlantic front.
Yeah, and speaking of the UK, maybe as a last question as we round up here, Laura, maybe I'll turn back to you and ask you a little bit about Brexit. and how that's, we've been talking a lot about the Commission during this conversation and what Brussels does, but that is maybe indicative of a new reality for the UK. And so from where you sit in looking at this, how much is it triangulation of interests now, or is the UK becoming a little bit of a hanging chad?
But I think it didn't make it easier for the EU to find agreement on lots of questions with the US, that we don't have the UK among us anymore. I think you can say that. That's the least you can say. Because obviously the UK will do lots of things to get a trade agreement with Washington. And that sets a standard for any kind of deal that the EU might still want to discuss with Washington. So it did improve our bargaining position, I would say. Mm-hmm. And I mean, yeah, as Dan was just talking about digital services taxes, that's one area. I mean, that's probably the one bargaining chip that the EU Commission or the EU countries still have in all of those discussions about tariffs that still need to be lifted. So why would we give that up so easily? But it would give us much more weight to do the same as to have our policies aligned with UK, with British policies, and obviously we're not. So that improves your bargaining capacity.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree with you. Just as we round up here, I think it's important to note that, the question that we said at the outset is this the concept of transatlantic trade still a current topic, or are we hanging on to something that a sort of T-tip version of reality that doesn't exist anymore? I think what this shows is that the fact that we jumped around from so many different topics, that it absolutely remains central to everything, but we are in the middle of a bit of a paradigm shift and don't know which boxes to put which issues in yet, and what to prioritize. So, I mean, before I turn over to Paul to close out, I just want to ask either of you whether you have something, a final comment you'd like to say, something I didn't ask you about that I should have, or a course correction on something that I said.
I see from one question someone asked about Nord Stream 2.
Oh, I was going to ignore that one, unfortunately.
I didn't want to ignore. I'll just do it. It's a contentious issue. I think the message here is the administration has realized, Germany is such a critical partner in so many ways. An issue like that shouldn't stop everything. It's like what I was saying about many other issues that we have these irritants. Are we going to let that stop the whole relationship, or are we trying to figure it out? I think the pressure now is on Germany, frankly, to understand how it helps Ukraine. That's the message. Okay, fine. You have this deal, it's done. Maybe you don't even use it. Maybe you make it operational, or maybe you finish the pipeline, but don't use it, because actually you don't need that gas right now. And what are you doing to help Ukraine become, still a successful country? So Germany could step up in major ways to help Ukraine that it's not doing now, and frankly, other East European countries. Germany slipped, in my mind, if I may say, its old Ostpolitik has become a Russland Politik. And all the countries in between Germany and the United States and Russia are also looking to Germany for some answers, and I haven't seen those coming in recent years.
I shouldn't have phrased it that way. I certainly would have. We could talk about this for an hour, and therefore, would you prefer to come to it last? And so, Laura, do you have a response to that before I turn to Paul?
I don't agree with everything that Dan's just said about Nord Stream 2, but I would agree that the whole agreement between Washington and Berlin right now sets us up to fail. Because there's a high risk that Putin will challenge that agreement and do things and threaten the Ukraine and cut it off the transit lines. And then we have to come up with something. So as a personal opinion, I would have rather used our political capital in our foreign policy relationship with the US for something other than this pet peeve of Merkel's. But that was a very critical remark. In general, I agree with her foreign policy. I think there would have been other issues that we could have used our, as I said, our political capital for. Speaking of climate policy, CBAM, and so on. So I probably would have chosen a different one, but it's a matter of taste. We will have elections in the fall. Let's see where the next government is taking this.
Absolutely. I mean, from my perspective, maybe the greatest insurance policy we might have against Russian funny business is the delight that Moscow might have in proving us all wrong. But anyway, that's it for me. Thank you so much for inviting me to moderate this wonderful panel with Laura and Dan. And I'll turn back over to Paul to close us out.
Thank you so much, Julia. Thank you also to our distinguished panelists, Laura von Daniels and Dan Hamilton. I know we could have continued for a few more hours, especially when it comes to the topic of Nord Stream 2, as you've noticed. But with this incredibly interesting and insightful session, our online event series, 6 months into the Biden presidency, transatlantic trends and aspiration, unfortunately comes to an end. Since Monday, in a total of 5 online sessions, we have talked about the status of transatlantic relations 6 months in, about common security and defense policy, and in this respect, what's at stake, about climate change policy and the question, can the United States be a credible leader, about post-COVID economic recovery, and if infrastructure is the answer, and last but not least, just now about global trade and investment. Do economic ties still bind Europe and the US? On Monday, at the very beginning of our online event series, German ambassador to the US, Her Excellency Dr. Emily Haber, underlined in her opening remarks how important it was to have German Chancellor Angela Merkel meet Vice President Harris and President Biden in Washington, D.C. just a few days ago. She also referred to the visits of German foreign ministers during the course of the last few days and weeks. These visits, including various encounters between members of Congress and German parliamentarians during the last few days and weeks, were not only encouraging, but necessary to find common ground on various, sometimes difficult topics we do not agree upon in every detail, but also to demonstrate that we have actually more in common than it seems sometimes, and that we have to learn a lot from each other. But also, and I think that was also made clear during the last session, that time is of the essence on both sides of the Atlantic. Apart from being able to discuss many crucial aspects of transatlantic relations during the last 3 days, with an incredible lineup of panelists, I really enjoyed that we were able to touch on these aspects, not only or not exclusively from a geopolitical or geostrategic point of view, but also from, let's say, a local or regional perspective. Apart from talking about Europe, Russia, and China, we've learned about the situation and possible cooperation on the ground, comparing Chicago and Houston with Munich and Cologne, or referring to the very complex economic ties, not only on the national level, but also on the level of states and regions, as Dan Hamilton did earlier on, just to mention a few examples during our sessions during the last few days. This very enriching exchange of thoughts and ideas from various perspectives would not have been possible without our distinguished panelists and speakers, our moderators, and many very interesting questions from our audience, from our participants. On behalf of Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to all of you for your time and for your invaluable input. A very special word of gratitude, however, to Stephen Sokol, Chairman of the American Council on Germany, and your team. You have done an incredible job, not only organizing this 3-day series of online events in cooperation with us, like all our moderators, including Julia, of course. You have also been a great moderator and a great host for this event. Thank you so much. For now, thank you very much again to each and everyone behind and in front of the cameras. I hope both KAS and ACG will meet you again soonest on one of our events. From Washington, DC, goodbye and stay safe.